The city was a noise with teeth. It chewed at him from all angles, honking glass, the acidic laughter of markets, the bright metallic tang of other people's sudden happiness, and every shard of feeling slid into Jacques like rain into a sieve, until there was no edge left to him. He walked the ballroom as if through a storm, palms slick beneath the tailored cuffs of his jacket, a smile practiced into the precise arc his position demanded. The gala glittered, 1,000 polite lights arranged to look like constellations. People tilted their heads and poured their emotions into the room, and the room poured them straight into him. Something in his chest tightened, the way the sky tightens before lightning. Sound became color, the chatter painted in thick citrus, the applause a smear of chrome that tasted of glass. He found himself stepping back, needing distance he couldn't explain. The world leapt in on him with the intimacy of hands. He didn't notice the linen service boy until he stumbled past the door to the service corridor. A tray clattered, a door opened and let out a clean corridor of supply closets and mop buckets and a staccato of distant laughter. The air there was cooler, tempered by bleach and cardboard, ordinary, unremarkable, and therefore, for Jacques, miraculous. Silence in a city of screams was not absence so much as a rare presence, a shape you could stand inside. He crossed the threshold and almost wept. There, half hidden between a stack of boxed napkins and a drying cart, a man sat with his back to the wall. The smallness of him gouged Jacques' attention like a cut. He was thin in the way tenderness is thin, no armor of tailored edges, no social currency reflected in the set of his shoulders. He wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands uncared for and raw at the knuckles. There was a bruise along his jaw the color of overdue wine. Jacques recognized hunger on the man the way other people recognized faces. It was a quality his body catalogued, the absence of projection. Everything around the man sang, bright, loud, overlapping, but the man himself seemed to sit inside a bubble that swallowed sound, silence absolute and compact. For someone like Jacques, whose senses bled for want of margins, it was not only relief, but something like permission. The man looked up. His eyes were the soft slate of rainwater, and he looked at Jacques not with hunger, but with an exhausted, practiced caution that made Jacques' chest contract with something like shame and an older, more selfish hunger, an ache to protect. When the man's fingers brushed the cardboard of a medicine box, a word, unformed like the memory of a sound, touched Jacques' awareness. "You can breathe here," it said, and it felt less like language than like an offering. He should have left. He should have closed the door and returned to the ballroom with the smile already pasted back on.
Instead, Jacques sat down on the floor opposite the stranger and let the noise of the gala fall away to a dim hum. Time rearranged itself into two parts, before the scentless hush and after. He learned the stranger's name the way people learn things in moments where survival edges into intimacy, in scraps. The man did not speak. He had not, in a way that matched the fine machinery of ordinary talk. His mouth moved sometimes, like someone practicing a foreign instrument, silent shapes, a throat tightening around words he didn't or couldn't let out. Jacques, who knew the smell of lies and the interior of people's regrets, did not assume muteness was simply a choice. He assumed damage. He assumed someone had seen fit to break him. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, and it was the most dangerous, unpracticed thing he'd done in years, an unfiltered sentence that belonged to no meeting, no board, no press release. The man's shoulders twitched, a small, incredulous laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He pushed his hair back and pulled a thin chain from beneath his collar, little prayer beads, dirty with use. He turned them in his hands the way someone might turn a key. Jacques watched the beads with the clinical curiosity he usually reserved for numbers and balance sheets. The beads were a token, an anchor, a small ritual for another life that tried to stay whole. He reached his own hand out before he was certain he wanted to touch the man at all. When their fingertips met, the contact was a lightning rod and a tether. The silence in the stranger's immediate space didn't nullify the world so much as compress it, and for the first time that night, Jacques found he could breathe. He should have thought about all the reasons to leave. He didn't. He bundled the stranger into an armful and led him from the basement corridor to a pressed linen room above the ballroom, where the smell of roses was thick as syrup, and doormen pretended not to know there had been anything out of the ordinary. He had a car outside. He had people who could make problems evaporate. He had never, in all his long life of making things happen, made a decision this small and privatized. In the taxi, the man slept against his shoulder with the posture of a person finally permitted rest. He measured every rise and fall of the stranger's chest, catalogued the color of the bruise at his jaw, tried without success to silence the twitch of responsibility that had settled in his sternum like a foreign seed. He imagined taking him home, placing him behind the gates of the estate like a secret he meant to keep. Protection felt for a moment like a currency he could spend. He didn't know his name yet, only initials, E.T., the way a hospital tag reduces a person to a function. It would take days before the man spoke even a single halting sentence. That truth sat like a second bruise in Jacques' body, the recognition of culpability.
There had been others who exploited and drugged and trafficked, people who made young bodies into commodity. The city could color itself with such things and call them industry. He thought sharply of the man who'd been convicted of such crimes just a week earlier, Uncle Stefan, a name that would soon fit into a larger puzzle and later be said with the cold civility of legal papers. For now, Jacques only wanted to shield the breathing man on his shoulder. The detective procedural instincts collapsed when he watched the stranger wake beneath a thin sun and look at him as if to measure whether he had become a rescuer or another predator. The simple act of making coffee became jurisprudence, each movement an ethical test. Jacques sat on the edge of the bed and watched the stranger sleep, thought of his family, a dynasty of quiet obligations and louder expectations, and felt them press against him, not always helpfully. Yet when he offered the man a pair of his own gloves, long leather, the ones used when he didn't want fingerprints, he was not calculating an advantage. He wanted stillness for this human, and if gloves translated into a promise of warmth, he would dress the world in them. In the days that followed, details stitched themselves into narrative. The man had been found unconscious in a hotel supply closet, drugged, with an identification number scrawled in someone else's handwriting inside his jacket. He had been brought to a public hospital. There were tests and a detective who wanted polite answers that Jacques couldn't give, not yet, and a string of legalities that tasted like vinegar. Jacques did what he had done all his adult life. He used influence, money, and influence masquerading as money. Doctors were paid to take second looks. Staff were shifted to the side. Background checks performed with the discretion of people who could afford discretion. He did not give orders about what had been done to the man. He asked questions and listened to the tilt of silence the man carried in his mouth. The more Jacques probed, the more things pointed, bluntly, towards trade. Someone in a network, a man named for his own kin, wires leading to small rooms where people were handed from hand to hand like objects. The word trafficking fell like a hammer, and Jacques felt for the 100th time since his inheritance the animal inside him awake. There were fights to fight, board votes to align, enemies to outmaneuver. He had never put a bailiff on the same list as a surgeon, but he would now. A week after the hotel,
in a private room at the clinic where the tape of his own life played continuous and merciless, the man who had been nameless and quiet sat across from Jacques, sleeves rolled to his elbows, prayer beads wound around his wrist. He signed with a shaky hand the single line that had become his first agency. His true name, Evan. E.T.
On the chart was shorthand and did not contain the small, bright shape of the rest of him, an artist's hand, a palette of bruised blues and stubborn greens he kept in his memory. "You're safe," Jacques said, which was the gentlest lie and the truest promise he knew how to make. Evan's fingers clenched. For the first time since Jacques had found him, his eyes filled, and he made a small sound that could qualify as a laugh, a sob, or both. He put a tube of paint beneath his chin and then tucked it away. The hospital would frown upon smudges. Later, in quieter rooms, Jacques would discover the breadth of Evan's silence, a nervousness around public microphones, a strategic avoidance of phones, a voluntary hermitage. He would also find that silence did not equal emptiness. There was a full interior, bright and precise. Evan's fingers mapped the world as color and texture, his mental life as an archive of images and touch rather than the torrent Jacques experienced as sound and smell. The test that changed everything was routine, absurdly so, a pregnancy panel performed because the man had been exposed to forced hormones and potent drugs. The technician in light blue scrubs had a face that forgot to be surprised until her numbers steeled her expression into professional gravity. "You're carrying," she said, and genderless panels on the computer blinked with forms. Words rearranged themselves. Jacques felt the word pregnancy strike him like something thrown. His brain, trained for quarterly reports and risk assessment, converted immediately to contingency planning, lawyers, a private nursery, potential threats to the children's future. But beyond those instincts, a deeper, stranger thing unfurled, an ache like the one he'd felt in that supply closet, only sharper. The very existence of this pregnancy made public the intimate collision he'd been trying to contain. If the board sniffed blood, if the press smelled scandal, the Tegan name, apex of power and reputation, could be ransacked. It should have been a simple matter of medical explanation, drugs and hormonal irregularities causing a false positive. Tests were rerun, blood was drawn and cataloged like jewels. But the numbers clung to their truth. Evan was pregnant. Not the kind of fluke one savored in melodrama, the kind that would demand explanation, guardianship, and an inventory of legal rights, finally. The quietness of Evan's life had always worked like a shield. Now it felt like a signpost. Jacques spent a night counting the ways the world would react. He saw headlines, "Tegan heir harbors mystery pregnant man." He saw the board's patience curdle to opportunism. He felt with intolerable specificity the pressure of matriarch Tegan's habitual dignity, a living geography of pedigrees and heirs.
He thought of Lady Helena, a public figure who had been his fiancée in the civil sense, a calculated tie beneficial to alliances, a woman whose porcelain smile had once been an asset and whose silence had been entrusted to his capacity for discretion. He had introduced Helena to the public because that was the kind of thing you did when you managed dynasties, align marriages, hedge votes, and make appearances that read like prosperity. The day's press releases had photographs of them stepping from limousines in matching somber suits, Helena clustered in pearls like a shield. She did not know the details of the closet or the bruise or the tapes. She assumed the script. She would be surprised, then betrayed, and not necessarily without reason, when the truth edged into her orbit. Before dawn, Jacques sat across from Evan in a small room plastered with neutral paint and hospital tranquility. The lights hummed. He took off his gloves and felt the cool of the air like a reprimand. Evan propped his paint-stained hands on his knees, eyes like storm glass. "I'll protect them," Jacques said. The sentence was both a transaction and a confession. It implied power and the abdication of certain things, autonomy, distance, because when you promised protection in his life, you signed the blank check of commitment. Evan only watched him. A private flame lit in his face, wary and fierce. He did not speak. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a small scrap of paper, a list that looked at first glance like grocery items and later read like a manifesto of survival. On it were names he'd refused to speak aloud, men who trafficked, clinics that turned blind eyes, a lawyer who took cash and made disappearances whisperable. The list had been a map of the life he clawed past to survive. Jacques read the names and felt bile rise at the familiarity of criminal networks. He called Brooks, his assistant, and set a chain of legal actions into motion with the kind of quiet command he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. They moved with a choreography practiced in boardrooms and cleaner rooms. An arrest was made. Uncle Stefan was taken, cuffed beneath flaring lights that made his face look sudden and small. The cameras that loved to watch power be humbled snapped photos and later wrote obituaries for reputations. It was the sort of justice that tasted faintly of retribution rather than reform. But justice took many forms in a city like this, and it sometimes began with a father or a brother or an uncle being led away. Evan watched the arrest on the television in the privacy of the townhouse Jacques put him in, a furnished flat that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and tobacco-free nights. He did not look surprised, only resolute. The bruise at his jaw had faded to a film of gray and purple, but remained a map of past violence.
Jacques spent nights on the couch across from him, the two of them arranged like a pair of shifted tectonic plates, too close to be completely separated, too dangerous to be allowed to settle casually into one another. There was a pragmatic solution the lawyers offered, an elegant legal arrangement packaged as spousal protection, a contract marriage. It would consolidate guardianship and give Evan access to resources and legal purpose. It would also transform a private crisis into a public fixture, a marriage of convenience with clauses that read like insurance policies. To Jacques' colleagues, it was a strategic move, a way to ensure that the dynasty's exposure was controlled. To Jacques, it was also a promise he had no right to make but felt compelled to keep. Evan read the contract with a delicacy that made Jacques uncomfortable. He circled clauses with fingers that had once been more accustomed to brushes than pens, his handwriting small and deliberate. He asked for terms that surprised everyone, limits on public appearances, a clause ensuring that he maintained full autonomy over his art and medical decisions, the right to terminate the arrangement at will. He wanted guarantees not just for himself, but for the children growing in him, the insistence that any guardianship could not be used to commodify their existence. Jacques found himself agreeing to things he'd told himself he would never allow. He signed papers in ink that looked as permanent as intent. He placed his palm over Evan's and felt a tremor, and not all of it was fear. There were guests fit to a dynasty who watched the arrangement with polite curiosity. Matriarch Tegan in her carved chair, eyes like chips of flint. Director Smith, whose smile always angled for advantage. Assistant Brooks, practical, humanized, a beta in the easy places between agendas. And Lady Helena, who accepted the public role of political consort with the same trained gentleness as her pearls. Helena's presence at a press conference months earlier had been a picture of composure. She did not yet know the contours of this secret. When she learned it, she would feel both betrayed and bereft, because alliances are made of truth and omission in equal measures. The contract was signed in a room with lower ceilings than the ballroom. It felt truer for being less grandiose. There were lawyers whose faces betrayed no pleasure, and a doctor, Dr. Hayes, who looked at Evan with hard, competent warmth and said what needed to be done. Dr. Vrendon, a name that already carried rumors of expedient ethics, was not present. Intellectual coalitions shifted with the speed of predators sniffing blood. The days slipped into a new arrangement. Evan began art lessons in a studio under the estate where he could work with his hands without the glare of cameras. He spoke in sentences that were small and careful, and finally, when he wanted something to be absolute, he would sign it in ink.
The silence that had once swallowed the world transformed into a deliberate vocabulary, brushstrokes, textures, and the occasional brave syllable, into a phone that would otherwise have been a blade. Jacques learned the practicalities of being near another human in ways that had nothing to do with contracts. He learned to let Evan's rhythms set their mornings. He cleared a room on the second floor, turned it into a studio with jars of solvent and careful light, and walked the distance between his office and Evan's space like someone on pilgrimage. He found that he could not stand the idea of someone else touching the fingers that had once been so small among the bric-a-brac of the hotel's supply closet. People noticed the silence. The staff at the estate whispered in the corners. Some of it was pity, some of it was prurience. The press noticed the photographs of pregnant Evan in a coat that didn't tug at attention, but still refused to be entirely demure. They began to ask questions. The board began to ask questions. Matriarch Tegan sent her first formal letter, which read less like reprimand and more like stone. Helena, by way of a carefully moderated public relations appearance, mentioned being supportive of her supposed fiancé's charitable actions without addressing anything specific. The first time the world tried to speak through Evan in a way that couldn't be ignored was at a small charity event, a solstice dinner that the dynasty had used for decades to shape mood and message. It was ceremonial and lit and terrible in the way public halls are, and Jacques felt the city breathing on him like a beast at the gate. He wore a tux with a line of ice in the seam. He carried himself as one carries the expectations of generations. Evan moved through the dinner like a shadow permitted the buffet. He kept his head low and held a small clutch in the crook of his arm. The room swarmed with emotion, gratitude, hunger, contempt folded into applause. An alpha senator raised his glass and offered an obvious speech about stewardship and legacy. People looked at Jacques as if he were the anchor of a perfect ship. That evening, the room's emotional output spiked, and Jacques felt it as if it were a physical assault. Waves of greed and admiration and canned sympathy pounding into him, each crest painted neon and metallic against his skin. Evan's hands found Jacques' sleeve then. The touch was not dramatic, no gripping or sign-making, only a light anchor of connection. Jacques turned to see Evan's face like a painted river. For a moment the gala's noise dulled. The room drained a little of its color around them, as if the world were learning to excuse them. He didn't perform a display, he merely let the room go still. Silence, once again, was not the absence, but the presence of a new axis. People felt it. Some shifted. A woman near the dais scoffed. A child looked confused. The senator, mid-sentence, faltered as the press sensed something off camera and turned their lens wondering. The sensation that Evan imparted in that room that night was a clean, surgical hush that suggested not silence alone, but the deliberate taking away of performative feelings. It was as if he could gently pry off the varnish of social emotion and reveal the raw wood beneath, forcing those in the room to feel themselves without the benefit of softened optics. It was a dangerous skill, one that could strip pretenses and create ruptures, useful to a man trying to survive and threatening to those who fed off the machinery of public face. Jacques loved it and feared it with equal intensity. After the event, obstacles multiplied into strategies. Director Smith, sensing instability, started to push papers across Jacques' desk. Cleanups, statements, suggested distance from the scandal. Matriarch Tegan's letters arrived in pulses of aristocratic ink. Lawyers argued about the visibility of children and the possibility of medical exploitation of infants whose physiologies would, if leaks were true, be unmatched. It was at the edge of this pressure, in the privacy of Evan's studio, where sunlight landed in a pool like a promise, that someone finally used the small, blunt word, betrayal. Evan sat with a canvas between his knees, fingers smudged blue. He raised his face, a small, brave soldier, and said his first clear sentence to Jacques in months. "I will decide what to tell her," he said. The pronoun hung like a gauntlet. "Tell who?" Jacques asked, because until then he had been managing the public perimeter, the lawyers, the arrests, the press statements. He thought in systems and contingencies, not in the fragile domestic geometry of human exchange. "Helena," Evan said. The name was like a small blade. He had met her once, briefly, in the marble foyer, a handshake that calculated its warmth to a precise degree. Helena was a necessary fiction, a political spouse meant to thread the Tegan family into a broader net of alliances. "It's dangerous," Jacques said. He thought of PR disasters, of the board's appetites, of Smith's fingers itching towards control. Evan's smile was slow, and for the first time Jacques could see a hint of the fury that had lived inside him all along. "It's mine," Evan said. "They used me as a thing. The twins are mine. If she is to be part of this, if she has been told something else, I will tell her the truth." Jacques felt the room close at the edges. He imagined a private meeting in which Evan, plainly and without journalists, said words that would rearrange alliances. He imagined Helena's face when she learned that the man credited as his sentimental figurehead was not, in fact, the sole female presence at the center of his life. He imagined the matriarch splicing her own code of vengeance through someone else's betrayal. He tried to stop her. "Helen?"
He tried to stop the idea, but there was something irrevocable in Evan's tone. He was asserting himself in a way that could cost him the fragile shelter Jacques had worked to build, but it would also crown him with ownership of his story. That had always been Evan's demand when he could speak: agency. If the board saw this revelation as a threat, they would mobilize. If they saw it as a blunder, they'd use it. But there was a cost to keeping secrets in a house built on them. Jacques had always said, privately, that secrets were a kind of rot. Evan wanted to excise it. There would be consequences, there would be fallout, there would be betrayal, of a kind Jacques had not yet fully imagined. And yet underneath the practical fear, a more primitive chord vibrated in him. The unexpected, stubborn protectiveness that made him want to let Evan decide his terms. Let him speak, Jacques wanted to say, and be there when the world recoiled or rallied. They had not yet told the public about the twins. They had not yet even named them. The scans in a folder in Dr. Hayes' office had numbers that memorized themselves into Jacques' bones. 2 heartbeats, 2 distinct signatures, one small hand's future, and the other a promise for a child who might, improbably,
change the politics of a species. In a private medical briefing, Dr. Hayes had been measured and clear. Pregnancies in null physiology were rare, unpredictable, and therefore a target for exploitation. There were committees that already whispered in hospitals. Evan turned from the canvas and pressed his palm flat against the pane of sunlight on the floor as if it were a map. He said quietly, "I do not want them to be things." Jacques, who had spent a life turning other people's people into marketable narratives, felt suddenly small and monstrous. He thought of the ways dynasties had taken children and remade them into heirs, into placeholders and inheritors of grudges. He thought of the matriarch's sterling smiles that had hidden the edge of threats. He put both hands on Evan's shoulders and felt the brush of powdered blue under his thumbs. "No," he said, "they will be ours." Evan breathed in a noise like a bloom, and then, with deliberate slowness, laid a small object on the table. It was a photograph from the day Jacques had found him, a creased photo that showed a supply closet corner, a pair of hands, a blurred glare. Someone had taken it. Someone had kept it. Evan had taken it from the days of his own life and kept it as evidence that he had existed in the world before anyone had arranged him into narratives. He slid the photo to Jacques. It was small and informal, a private thing. Jacques felt a choke in his throat. He saw the bruise at a different angle. He saw the glare of something that had thrummed with commerce and cruelty. The photograph made the moment not only intimate, but legal. It made it visible.
"We should think about Helena," Jacques said at last, because pretense had to be measured against consequences. She deserves to know her role in this, if only to choose." Evan nodded once. "I will tell her what she needs to know," he said, "not to make her a villain, but so she has a choice." There was a simple nobility to that. It was, in a way, Jacques had not anticipated, another form of protection, not only to set boundaries against exploiters, but also to offer someone else the truth and a chance to refuse or accept on their own terms. It was exactly the kind of moral architecture Jacques had learned to admire in council rooms and court filings, and, in his quieter moments, to envy. They wrote a list of who to tell and who to withhold from, a small choreography of disclosures, doctor allies, legal teams, a handful of trusted staff. Matriarch's inner circle would not be included without evidence and a plan. And Helena would be told privately, before the tabloids could make her into a spectacle, because that was the least they owed her as a person who had already been folded into the Tegan project. When the decision was made, Jacques felt something else arrive, that corrosive, private thing that often sneakily followed him through decisions made for the good of others. He worried about how much he would have to explain of himself to make his actions credible, about the supply closet, about the night he had not walked away. He was used to being a man who made contracts and took signatures and held options. Explanations to the people he loved were never a draft clause. They were ragged, human, and the most dangerous. He would learn, painfully, how to give them. The estate felt different after the decision. The house that had been a fortress for power now had rooms filled with baby supplies, white linen, soft nests, gloves, and instructions. The nursery, for all its pressure, had a window that watched the garden. Jacques, who had always preferred the control of boardrooms, found himself pacing at night in the nursery's dim light. He practiced names and syllables like a mantra. He placed clean gloves beside small jars of paint, things that belonged to both men, and in doing so created an inventory of tenderness.
Evan began to talk in small increments, brushed words, words caught on his tongue, then liberated by careful hands. The first complete sentence he devoted to the children was written in blue ink in the margin of a calendar he kept. "I will teach them to speak with hands and paint." It was both plan and vow. The press snooped, as they do, and the board whispered. Director Smith made a show of competence, while his eyes darted like a man looking for leverage. The matriarch sent a vase of white camellias with a note that read, "Protect the lineage." The note was double-edged. Jacques put the vase on the sideboard and watched its shadows. There was one night when Jacques woke to the sound of water and found Evan in the nursery at 3 in the morning, paint-stained forearms glinting in the moonlight, a canvas propped against the crib. He had been painting the twins' silhouettes, two small ovals of quiet that glowed dark against the studio light. He did not look at Jacques when he spoke. "I will tell Elena after I know she is whole," he said. "Whole?" Jacques asked, because he did not yet know what that word meant in this context. Evan's jaw worked. "If she is a person only made for appearances," he said slowly, "then she is less of a victim than we might think. She deserves the truth before the world makes the decision for her." Jacques, who had weaponized appearances for decades, understood the risk. He also understood, with a suddenly childlike clarity, the kind of mercy in which you allowed someone to refuse the role performed for them. It was an idea both fragile and radical under the weight of the Tegan name. For the first time since he had found Evan in that supply closet, Jacques felt both the heavy machinery of institutions and the small, delicate labor of human conversation, and he began to understand that the latter had to proceed even when the former wanted to smash and claim. If one thing had changed everything, it was that silence wouldn't bail them out. It was a balm and also a hazard. Hands would have to be used, words would have to be made present. The city's howl would not go away because he wished it. It would, instead, be turned into something else, a chorus that either crushed them or was softened by the presence of the twins. When the early storms came, anonymous threats sent to the estate, a forged letter alleging improprieties, a late-night message to the board suggesting Dr. Hayes was a fraud, Jacques had already built contingencies. He'd had to. He flexed resources and made threats that were quiet, precise, and effective. Arrests and legal maneuvers followed. Uncle Stefan was no longer a mere rumor. He was a headline about a man handcuffed under the lights, his grinning face under the flashbulbs. But arrests did not erase deeper networks, and Jacques knew that the prosaic business of defense would last for months. For Evan, everything had shifted into a focus of craft. He painted and sorted and named color with the kind of devotion one reserves for beloved things. He took long walks in the estate gardens and came back with pockets full of small treasures, feathers, blue-tinted stones, dried leaves. He pressed them in a small book and labeled them with the calm authority of a person reclaiming a life. There were moments of tenderness that felt illicit to Jacques, washed with a sweetness that made him anxious. Evan would braid his hair behind his ear and laugh low and private, like someone who had just learned an elegant secret. Jacques would watch and feel his world tilt toward domesticity. It terrified him and comforted him in equal measure. There was also the quiet, terrifying fact that his hyper-empathy was becoming more of a risk the closer he stood to Evan and to the children. He could feel the baby's tentative signatures already, like lights that didn't belong to him yet. When Evan slept, Jacques would lie awake and sense the territory of the house as a geography of other people's feelings. He would imagine the infant's neural signatures being mapped by committees and labs, and the image arced his chest with a violence he couldn't name. Helena remained mostly an image, public, porcelain, but Jacques had set the process in motion to invite her into a private, framed conversation. He planned to tell her the details before the media could. He would give her the dignity of truth and a choice that she had not been afforded before. It was, in its strange way, a test of whether those trained to be props had the capacity for independence when granted the small gift of information. There were nights when the two men argued like people with new intimacy, over light bulbs, the arrangement of jars, whether the nursery curtains should be white or gray. Those scrapes were real and human and taught Jacques how the day-to-day of love might look, tender, practical, and sometimes petty. They were also a training ground for the larger fights to come. One afternoon, Jacques received a call from Brooks. "We can arrange a private meeting," Brooks said, voice careful, "with Helena before the board." The offer tasted like both relief and danger. It meant the truth could be told calmly, without cameras. It meant also that the intimacy of their home would be invaded by someone who represented not simply a person, but a public myth. "Arrange it," Jacques said. He would face the matriarch later, the board later. For now, he needed to let Evan claim his voice in a way that would be seen as an honest human act, not a scandal launched by one of the board's machinations. "Agreed," Yevon said. He spent a day preparing, painting 2 small canvases and folding them into a box. "If she comes and doesn't understand," he said, "I will show her. I will not weaponize the children, but I will not allow their truth to be denied." Jacques found himself pacing again that night, between the study where lineage was calculated and the nursery where futures were imagined. He thought of the way power bent people, and also of the way he had once shaped himself to be unbending. He had been a man who weighed options and executed them. Now he was learning to be a person who could let another weigh and execute, and perhaps fail and recover. Outside, the city continued to scream, unaware and uncaring. Inside, the house contracted, preparing itself for a conversation that would change the social geometry of the Tegan name. The minute hands of clocks moved with the stubborn deliberation of inevitability. When the day came to call Helena into a small, private salon that smelled faintly of bergamot and old books, Jacques realized he was not equipped by pedigree to make the decision, how to wrap a personal truth in the language of pedigree and press releases, and he found that sentences built for shareholders were inadequate for another human's heartbreak. The salon door clicked shut behind Lady Helena, and for a moment the room was full of nothing but measured fragrance and the precise geometry of other people's expectations. Helena stood like an emblem, hair drawn back in an economy of silk, a dress tailored so that it suggested without needing to speak. Up close, Jacques could see the tiny fatigue at the edges of her eyes, the small lines molded by years of smiling on cue. She extended a gloved hand, an old habit of form, and then, as if thinking better of it, folded the glove back into her clutch. It was a private retraction that told Jacques more about her than any public appearance ever could. "Thank you for coming," he said, and the words came with the stiffness of a man who'd practiced courtesy in boardrooms where nothing like this could be allowed to ripple. Helena's smile was curious and quick. "You sounded grave on the phone." Jacques noticed how her gaze slid almost automatically toward the nursery wing window, toward the little architectural choices he had made and could not hide, the soft curtains, the row of jars, the practical glove placed conspicuously on the side table. She, too, knew how to read domestic modifications. There were alliances embedded in paint colors. Evan had asked, quietly and with a new gravity, to be present. He sat across from Helena on the opposite settee, palms in his lap, paint faintly crusted at his nails. The pregnancy had made him luminous in a way the cameras could not capture, an inner architecture of expectancy. His jacket fit differently now. There was a new weight to him. He did not speak at first. He looked at Helena with a steadfastness that might once have been called defiance. Before Jacques could invent the measured statements his staff would have drafted, Evan rose and moved toward the small table where he'd placed 2 boxed canvases and a photograph. The movement was precise and calm. There was an economy to the way he handled objects that were once about survival and were now, remarkably, instruments of truth. "I will tell you a story," Evan said. His voice, when it came, was soft, as if each syllable had to be coaxed into the air, like paint out of a tube. "Please," Helena's lips parted, in a way that suggested she expected, perhaps even hoped, for a different kind of theater. Evan slid the photograph across the table. It was the same creased image Jacques had once seen, a cramped supply closet corner, the blurred shape of a hand, a bruise, 2 small interlaced fingers.
It smelled faintly of old smoke after being handled. Jacques watched Helena's hand hover above the photo, the tiny tremor of someone whose life had been made of rehearsed moves and who now felt the dissonance of a life she had not rehearsed for. "This is where I began to be seen," Evan said, "not as a commodity, but as something human. That man," he nodded toward the image, not needing to name Stefan for Helena to understand the implication. "He trafficked. He used people. He was arrested. That part is true, and it is out of our hands to punish." Helena's face maintained politeness. Behind the composed surface, something like recognition moved. Not surprise at the existence of crimes. She lived in a world built to manufacture them, but an awareness that truth's revelation could corrode the scaffolding that kept her secure. Evan opened one of the boxes. The first canvas was small, painted with cautious hands, 2 circles of muted color suspended against a washed gray. Lines of pigment bled into one another. It was not a declaration of triumph, but an atlas of uncertainty. "They are twins," Evan said. "They are not a medical fluke. They carry signatures no clinic has seen in this combination. One is a strong projection, alpha traits. The other carries a linker pattern, an unusual binding tendency. That makes them targets." He set the second canvas beside the first. This was bolder, a field of blue on which a black thread ran like a pulse line, and at the center a small burst of contrasting warmth, an impressionistic representation of a child who altered the way others registered themselves. The painting, for all its simplicity, carried a geography of care. "They want to use them," Evan went on. "Not all of them, but some people in positions of power see value in creatures who do not conform. Director Smith has been pushing for research access. There are documents, emails, proposals that suggest an intention to petition for guardianship and clinical custody, should the board be convinced it's in the children's interest. Dr. Vrenden," he paused. The name hit like a metal tack in the fabric of the room. "Vrenden has been cozy with laboratories that are less than ethical." Helena's fingers tightened around her clutch. For a second she was no longer the picture of composure. "Go on," she said. Evan did. He showed her the list, the small paper Jacques had once read, evidence of payments, a thread of connections that revealed how commerce could disguise itself as care. He spoke of the forged reports that had surfaced, of late-night meetings where terms like clinical trial and funding opportunity were tossed like coin.
He explained the way null physiology, already rare, had been priced by some as a resource rather than a human reality. Jacques watched Helena's face shift. For a woman trained to behave as if the world were an elegant set of surfaces, the truth cut in jagged. He felt, as he listened, the old shapes of his own life, the commitments to image, the endless smoothing of jagged things, reasserting themselves in his body as old reflex. When Evan finished, there was a silence that felt more like an arrangement taking hold than a lull. Helena set the boxes down with deliberate care, as if she could close a lid on the future and observe it like a specimen. "Why tell me?" she asked then, and the question was not merely about logistics. It was a question about obligation, about what one owed to people who had been folded into fabricated lives. "Because you are part of their orbit," Evan said simply. "You were presented as a consort for you to fill a role. That's not your fault, but if you are to continue in that role, I do not want your consent withheld. I want you to know, in full, what has been done in our name and what is being planned." Helena studied him. There was a long private recalculation behind her eyes. "If I were to respond publicly," she said, the way a strategist practices words aloud, "I would be expected to defend the family's line." "Are you?" Evan asked, voice even. Helena's jaw moved. "For a long time, I thought I was defending something called legacy. That gave me a place. But I have long been comfortable with the smallness of my agency. I learned that restraint looks like virtue." It was an admission both private and explosive. Jacques felt the room tilt. For a man who'd spent decades negotiating promises and power, Helena's small confession was a fissure in the public facade. "I am asking you to choose," Evan said, leaning forward a little. "Choose with the information. No one should decide for you how you will be involved. If you choose silence to preserve the dynasty, I will not call you a traitor. But if you choose to stand in a way that protects my children, our children, then I will be grateful. I am done with being decided for." The word "our" that Evan did not mean in the legal sense hung in the air like a small, dangerous prayer. Jacques' chest bent like someone under an enormous sky. Helena's hands came up in a movement that was almost a cross between surrender and acceptance. "I have been offered scripts my whole life," she said softly. "Act this way when cameras are present. Smile now so that later the family can be curated. But perhaps the point of having a voice is not to recite the scripts offered to us." For a heartbeat, Jacques imagined the scene playing differently. Helena stepping to the lectern at a press conference and delivering a rehearsed, tactical defense of the board. It was the easy path. Instead, the expression that settled on her face was a complicated one. Fear, braided with an undercurrent of something far more radical. Autonomy. "I will not be a prop," she whispered. Evan's eyes filled with a small, bright astonishment. "If you choose to stand with us," he said slowly, "you have to know what that means. It will make you a target."
Elena's smile returned, but it was not the polished mask of public openings. It matched something in Evan's paint-stained palms. "I have already been targeted for longer than either of you can imagine," she said. "If the price of choosing myself is to be called traitor, then tell me what to do." They planned in that small salon for hours, not in tactical terms only, but in rituals of mutual accountability. Elena insisted on hearing every document aloud. Evan asked for legal terms to be spelled clearly.
Jacques agreed to set up protective measures and to relinquish certain managerial decisions to a special council headed by Brooks and a neutral external ethics panel. Elena demanded with surprising force that no one should speak for the twins in any official capacity without parental consent. She signed a statement on clean paper and in ink that felt like a covenant, promising to do what she could to resist manipulations by the board, but not to be punished for having been presented with a role earlier in her life. "Everyone deserves truth," she said finally, "even people who have been made into symbols." There was a strange, terrible beauty in the compact they formed. It was an act of treason against assumptions and a quiet alliance forged between three people whose lives had been heavily mediated by the language of power. When they left the room, the pretense of the Tegan name still hummed in the corridors like an old electrical current, but inside those currents a new circuit had been built. The betrayal that stunned the board did not arrive as a scream, but as a whisper. Elena, in a move that shocked everyone accustomed to her public composure, arranged a private breakfast with the matriarch. The intention was to tell her about the twins and to request support for a coordinated statement that would emphasize the family's unity and stewardship. Matriarch Tegan sat with the sculpted face of someone who had been raised to believe that appearances were the currency of survival. The conversation, private, perfunctory, began like the others, measured pleasantries, the carving out of space for familial dignity. Midway through, Elena produced the signed statement and slid it across the table. The note read not as obedience, but as a demand. The children would be protected, their bodies not used for private research under any circumstances, and their guardianship would rest with their parents exclusively. The matriarch's gaze, which had been carved by time into an unshiftable plane, flashed. "This will complicate things," she said. "It will," Elena agreed. Then she did something that people who lived in dynastic houses learned not to do. She looked at the matriarch with the nakedness of someone asking for permission to be human. We can no longer choose silence so that others may have power. You could see, if you watched closely, a micro-shift in the matriarch's expression. There was a calculation, alliance, optics, succession. But she was also an old woman who had outlived certain enmities, and who, in some private chamber of herself, was not entirely without tenderness. Perhaps it was the notion of grandchildren. Perhaps the sight of an infant's potential softened a stiffness no scandal could crack. What followed was not fulsome approval, but rather a careful, strategic acceptance. The matriarch agreed to the statement, but she insisted on neutral legal oversight to ensure that no rash decisions were made. The board, meanwhile, had not been idle. Director Smith, sensing a chance to exploit fear and to push Jacques from the seat of control, began to assemble allies. He circulated memos suggesting that Jacques' personal entanglements rendered him unfit for the custodial decisions required of one in his position. He whispered the possibility of a proxy vote and of emergency powers that could, under a pretext of safeguarding corporate assets, transfer guardianship to an appointed trust. Elena's choice arrived like a sandbag thrown at a precise structural weakness. Rather than publicly defend the board, she chose to leak curated documents, emails that showed Smith's eagerness for clinical partnerships, and a meeting where Vrendon had promised results that would pioneer revenue streams. The leak was surgical, enough to show intent, not enough to sensationalize the medical conditions of the babies. The press had the story they loved, corporate greed and scandal, but it lacked the salaciousness of intimate details. The board scrambled.
Smith's coalition fractured under the weight of his own words. The betrayal that stunned the old guard was not a treachery of personal spite. It was a pragmatic, morally inflected choice. It refused to treat the twins as currency. For the public and for the board, the narrative spun into a new shape. Elena, the once obliging consort, had chosen to be a guardian of truth. Director Smith, the technocrat, had chosen the logic of profit over people, and he had left a paper trail. Smith reacted with the venom of the cornered. He called in favors, contacted potential proxies, distributed a dossier that implied incompetence on Jacques' part. He approached Dr. Vrendon, cajoling him to testify that the twins, if placed under institutional guardianship, would be safe and advance science. Vrendon, whose ethics had been hollowed out in the face of research funding, balked at first and then agreed, but someone, Brooks and an ally in legal counsel, moved faster. Vrendon's correspondence was subpoenaed. Evidence surfaced that linked him to questionable clinics. He was suspended pending investigation. The siege of the estate that followed was less theatrical war than a series of legal skirmishes seasoned with a media hunger for spectacle. Cameras camped at the date, petitioners filed motions, activists rallied, some in solidarity with the family, others in protest at the perceived elitism of the Tegans.
The matriarch, in public, maintained her composure, but privately had been worn by the weight of reputation and the sight of grandchildren on the horizon. The vote went to a narrow margin and then collapsed under procedural questions and an internalization of the optics. Smith's attempt failed. He had miscalculated the human variable, that a single person, Helena, could upend a calculation based purely on balance sheets. Smith, furious and desperate, chose a different tactic. He sought to pressure the medical team into an early induction under the guise of safety, an attempt to create a narrative where emergency necessitated institutional intervention. He approached Dr. Vrendon again, trying to coax him into recommending a controlled delivery at an institutional clinic so that specimens could be collected and legally appropriated. The man, coward that he was where ethics were concerned, but not where self-preservation called, flinched when he saw that the internal counsel had already unearthed his salons of trade and ransom. He withdrew. When the night came, when Evan first felt the pattern of contractions like a new kind of drum, the estate felt very small and very large at once. Jacques had stayed awake, pacing once more between the nursery and the study, listening for the rhythm of the house and the city beyond. He felt his own sensors flare, public fear, private panic, press beyond the gates like distant lightning. Inside the estate's walls, he tried to be a single, steady thing. It was in the birthing suite Jacques had designed with Dr. Hayes that the world narrowed to the shudder of breath and the mathematics of pain. The room smelled of linen and antiseptic. Jars of paint had been moved away from the sterile field. A midwife from the city's leading neonatal center had arrived, and a pediatric team stood ready like a practiced storm crew. "Trust your body," Dr. Hayes told Evan, in a tone that was both clinical and compassionate. "We will monitor everything. You lead us." Evan's hands were pale, and his fingers flitted unconsciously along the prayer beads he wore. Old beads, a talisman against impossible things. He gripped Jacques' hand between contractions, a small tether. Jacques felt, with a clarity that his hyper-empathy made brutal, the echo of every nurse's anxiety in the room, filtered for him into 1,000 pricking sensations. He managed them the way one manages a hurricane, focusing on one small, practical thing at a time. He adjusted IV lines. He held a glass of water. He whispered awkwardly, "I am here."
There was a moment within the labor where sensations ratcheted upward. Evan's body moved in waves, and Jacques felt the room's anxiety spike into a high, bright shard. For a second, he thought he might be overwhelmed and collapse under the weight of other people's fear. Then something settled in him, a disciplined narrowing of attention that felt like prayer without doctrine.
He touched Evan's shoulder and breathed, matching his inhale to Evan's. In the middle of a contraction, Evan reached out with his mind, not a flood this time, but a single fragile projection. Jacques felt it like a color, a warm, stubborn gold. It was not the raw roar of a full empathic tide, nor the blank absorption of null. It was a new frequency, the twins' presence, immediate and small. Jacques became aware of two little signatures tangled in a way that felt like the tuning of strings. He wanted to cry out with the violence of it, but he leaned into the motion of care instead. Hours passed in a compressed, sacred geometry. There were protests and motions outside, but inside the suite, the universe had been reduced to a handful of people and the precise choreography of birth. At one point, a reporter's drone pinged beyond the estate gates, and the nurses glanced towards the window with practiced indifference. The labor took on a metaphysical edge. It wasn't mystical in the religious sense. There were no miracles, only the dense, incandescent reality of two new lives emerging and altering the calibration of every adult in the room. When the first cry came, it was a sound that turned the oxygen in Jacques' lungs to light. Mason arrived first, a small, furious sound that filled the room with a stark, aggressive clarity. He took up space with authority, even as he fit into little curled fingers. His projection, minuscule but forceful, made the midwife take a step back in surprise. The infant's presence was like a bell ringing, bright and insistent. He was an alpha in miniature, his signature immediate and buzzy. Lucia followed, quieter at first, and then like a thread unfurling. She seemed to arrive with a small linkage, soft, porous, and fluent in how she took in the room's textures and echoed them back in gentled waves. The pediatric team murmured wonder. They had expected physiological complexity, but not the way these newborn signatures braided into the room's emotional field. Lucia's presence calmed the nurse's own minute panic with the oddest tender effect, a linker trait revealing itself as an infant's capacity to steady. Evan wept then, actual, uncontained tears, and Jacques felt the hot metallic wash of relief and new ferocity. He had held the line of practicalities, had kept threats at bay, but here in the flooded hush of postpartum, he allowed himself to feel the entire sweep of what had been lost and what had been won. He kissed Evan's forehead and tasted salt and paint and a future he had not learned to name. The media frenzy that followed was inevitable, but the narrative had shifted. Instead of a gossipy scandal, the coverage became, for many outlets, a human interest story, complicated by ethical questions. Helena's earlier leak and statement had framed the public discourse differently. The board's attempted moves were scrutinized as potential overreach. Director Smith, exposed in the light, began to lose allies.
There were inquiries, resignations, and some arrests, not theatrically broad, but targeted with legal teeth. Dr. Vrendon was fired and later faced a professional board for his complicity in questionable research partnerships. Uncle Stefan remained incarcerated. The political calculus that had once weighed power in tidy columns now appeared jagged and morally problematic. The public, always hungry for spectacle, had discovered a new taste, stories where vulnerability and institutional hubris collided, and where those with power were held to account.
Inside the estate, days softened into a slow, aching routine of feedings and midnight consolations. Mason's projection was loud. He often announced himself with a vigorous wail and a startling confidence. Lucia had a small, steady hum that seemed to settle other people's anxieties like a balm. Jacques, learning to ride the new rhythms, found himself becoming more discerning in how he let the world flood him. He spent an hour most mornings with a counselor who taught him techniques of focus, simple breath work modified for someone whose senses would otherwise be assaulted by a child's noise. Evan recovered his voice in increments. At first, he spoke in short, luminous sentences, small truths, and then, slowly, in conversations that stretched minutes into sustained presence. He told the twins their names aloud in a ritual that made them real in ways no contract could. He painted when he could in the quieter hours, translating the strange hues and textures of infancy into images that would later define his Silent Collection series. He kept his prayer beads around his wrist and taught Lucia to touch them, to trace the worn stones with tiny fingers. The board went through a reorganization. Smith was voted out of key committees and left the executive suite under pressure from shareholders who preferred stability over scandal. The Tegan dynasty, damaged but not dissolved, reinvented itself in the public imagination, less a monolithic edifice than a complicated family with contradictions. Helena's reputation changed in the eyes of strangers. Where there had once been the cool porcelain consort, there now was a woman who had made a public choice. Some applauded her bravery, others whispered betrayal. Helena accepted both with a dignity that was not clouded by needing to be loved by all. The months that followed were not an eradication of trouble. There were legal skirmishes, a suit from a fringe research group claiming rights to certain biological data, a suit that Jacques and his counsel fought and won, and the constant background of press that sought to minimize or maximize events for clicks. But within their home, a new language took root. Consent became a series of small, explicit agreements. Evan's agency was the central plank of every decision. Jacques learned the arithmetic of apologies and the architecture of respect.
As the twins grew, their peculiarities manifested in ways that were less threatening than human beings outside the estate had feared. Mason's projection could be startling. He could, at 3 months, announce his displeasure in a way that made adults rethink their positions. But he was also the kind of child who laughed loud at color, and whose presence made Jacques hungry with fierce domestic adoration. Lucia, even as a baby, seemed to steady rooms with a small linking quality. Staff who were prone to anxiety noted how her gentle coos could slow a panic into breath. Evan returned to painting in fits and starts. He developed a practice. He called it initially the Silent Collection, because the paintings sought to translate experience into a chromatic vocabulary. His canvases became a bridge. Viewers described them as translational devices that let them feel a small version of synesthetic perception. His work demanded patience from audiences, and that demand, in time, became the point. He refused in interviews later to allow his art to be read as merely therapeutic. It was, he said, an offering of translation. The gallery opening, arranged a little over 5 years later, was both a public event and a quiet reckoning. The Tegan name was present, but it was no longer in the single monolithic voice it had once been. The exhibition was installed in a reclaimed warehouse that smelled faintly of varnish and old wood, the kind of place an artist chose because its shadows allowed nuance. Jacques and Helena stood at a distance, less conspicuous in public than they had been in the past.
Evan moved among guests with a calm he had earned, small clusters of people drawn by his work and the odd magnetism of his personal story. The twins, now toddling compacts of movement and curiosity, explored the fringes of the gallery under watchful, adoring adult eyes. Mason, with his booming proclamation of interest, reached for a ribbon and made a small crowd laugh. Lucia toddled to a display and stood transfixed. She reached out and touched a panel, and the light in the room changed as if acknowledging her. An elderly critic, someone who had once written with sharp disdain about the Tegan dynasty, stopped and described aloud how a particular painting made him remember the texture of a quiet room. People who had expected scandal found themselves encountering something more complicated, a family that had made a messy choice, been chastened and trained by consequences, and emerged with a fragile and imperfect grace. For Jacques, the moment was less about public vindication than about the steadying domestic triumph of watching his children play within a space he had fought to keep them safe from. He had learned to let go in ways that did not require detachment, to be present and responsible without attempting to own every small thing. Helena, standing near a canvas that Evan had called Tether, looked at Jacques with a small, private smile.
Their history would always carry the strain of arrangements and duty, but something had altered the geometry of their interactions. They had moved from scripted roles to negotiated standing. She reached out and took Jacques' hand the way a person takes another into a shared oath. Evan, watching from the threshold of a small gallery room where his own work translated into conversation, felt the threads of silence and noise braided into something that resembled a life. He had, in the span of years, reclaimed words and taught his children to be loud and gentle in equal measure. He had translated trauma into the vocabulary of survival and art. He had not been fixed into a tidy narrative of redemption that made past violations into mere prologue. He had done the harder thing. He had insisted upon being known on his own terms. In the months and years that followed, the world around the Tegans shifted slowly. Laws moved in pieces toward better protection of vulnerable people. Research protocols, influenced by public scrutiny and a new generation of ethicists, tightened. Institutions were, in some corners, less willing to treat human variability as fiscal opportunity. The change was not total nor immediate. Institutions are stubborn. But small examples multiplied, cases where families demanded agency and won, where marginalized voices were amplified, not to become an aesthetic, but to be legally heard. On quiet nights, Jacques would sit in the nursery that now smelled of lemon oil and a child's shampoo, and he would watch the twins sleep, one with a brow furrowed like a small thinker, the other peaceful like a lake at dawn. He kept, on a small shelf, a pair of gloves he wore sometimes without thought, a relic of the night he had first taken someone into his hands because he couldn't bear to leave him alone. He touched them gently, a private ritual that belonged to both memory and a promise he had to keep every day. Evan finished the final piece of the opening series with a small dedication in the margin, "For those who taught me to speak." He gave the piece to Jacques and then to Helena, his handwriting careful and full of intention. The dedication was not a surrender of the past, but a recognition of those who had learned to be allies, imperfect and human, in the long days of repair. There were, of course, evenings when Jacques' old reflexes returned, a sharp calculation in a boardroom, a cold assessment that would have once dismissed feelings as liabilities.
But now, when he felt the inclination to hide, he remembered the supply closet, the small damped box where a man had taught him silence, and he remembered the photograph Evan had slid across a table. He remembered what the word protect had meant when stripped of all machinations. He learned to speak apologies when they were due, and to give boundaries space to breathe. And once, on a private afternoon when the estate smelled of rain and wet soil, Helena took Evan's hand and looked directly at him.
"You told me the truth," she said, "and I betrayed an expectation. I do not regret it." Yvonne smiled, a small private thing that spoke of long work and a new equilibrium. "We told each other the truth," he said, "and that made us dangerous to those who profit from secrets. Perhaps that is the only kind of power worth having." Jacques, who had once measured his life in acquisitions and control, leaned back and allowed the house to hold him. The city beyond continued to scream in its various pitches, but inside the estate the noise had been converted into something else, a family learning to inhabit an unruly, messy, luminous life. Years later, at another opening, a child tugged at Jacques' sleeve and asked what his father's face meant when it softened. Jacques looked down at Mason, at the earnestness in the child's eyes, and realized that the answer was simple and terrible and true. He bent, kissed the child's forehead, and said, "It means I'm learning."